The year was 1776. While American revolutionaries were signing their Declaration of Independence across the Atlantic, in a dimly lit room at the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria, a different kind of revolution was quietly beginning. A professor named Adam Weishaupt was about to create something that would outlive empires, survive centuries of persecution, and become the subject of more conspiracy theories than perhaps any other organization in human history. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The real Illuminati, not the shadowy puppet masters of modern conspiracy theories, but the actual historical organization, was far stranger, more complex, and infinitely more fascinating than any fiction Hollywood could devise. Tonight, as we drift together into the gentle currents of bedtime history, we'll uncover the dark truth about how a small circle of Bavarian intellectuals accidentally created the blueprint for every secret society conspiracy that would follow. This isn't the story you think you know. This isn't about celebrities making hand gestures or hidden symbols on dollar bills. This is the true origin story of an organization that began with the noblest intentions and ended up becoming the template for humanity's deepest fears about hidden power. Because sometimes, the most dangerous ideas aren't the ones that sound sinister from the beginning. Sometimes, they're the ones that sound perfectly reasonable. The man who would change the world was born in 1748 in the small Bavarian town of Ingolstadt. Adam Weishaupt's early life reads like a carefully orchestrated irony. Orphaned at the age of 5, he was raised by his godfather, Baron Johann Adam Eichstädt, a man of progressive ideas who ensured the young Adam received the finest education available. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. That education came from the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540, had perfected the art of intellectual formation over 2 centuries. They understood something profound about human nature. Give us a child's mind for 7 years, and we will shape the man forever. Young Weishaupt was enrolled in their school at age 7, where he learned Latin, rhetoric, philosophy, and most importantly, the Jesuit method of thinking, systematic, hierarchical, and absolutely certain of its own righteousness. For 13 years, Weishaupt absorbed their teachings. He studied their organizational structure, their methods of recruitment, their techniques for building loyalty, and their approach to secrecy. The Jesuits didn't just educate, they indoctrinated. They created men who thought in terms of missions, who understood the power of ritual and ceremony, who knew how to build networks that transcended national boundaries. But something went wrong, or perhaps terrifyingly right. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV issued a papal bull that would echo through history. With a single document, he dissolved the Society of Jesus. Across Europe, Jesuit schools closed, Jesuit properties were seized, and thousands of highly educated, highly trained men found themselves suddenly without purpose. In Bavaria, the dissolution created a power vacuum at the University of Ingolstadt, where Weishaupt had just earned his doctorate in law. At 25 years old, Weishaupt found himself appointed to a position that had been held exclusively by Jesuits for generations, professor of canon law. Here was a man trained by the Jesuits, now holding a Jesuit position, in a university still crawling with former Jesuits who viewed him as an interloper. The irony was delicious, and it was intentional. But Weishaupt had learned more from his Jesuit education than his former teachers might have preferred. He had absorbed their methods while rejecting their message. Where the Jesuits sought to strengthen the Catholic Church's hold on human thought, Weishaupt began to envision something entirely different. A world freed from what he saw as the tyranny of organized religion. The Enlightenment was sweeping across Europe like wildfire. Voltaire was challenging the Church with wit and reason. Diderot was compiling an encyclopedia that dared to suggest human knowledge could exist independent of divine revelation. Across the German states, intellectuals were beginning to whisper dangerous questions. What if reason, not faith, was the path to truth? What if human beings could perfect themselves without divine intervention? Weishaupt absorbed these ideas like a sponge, but he understood something his fellow Enlightenment thinkers often missed. Ideas, no matter how brilliant, were powerless without organization. The Catholic Church had dominated European thought for over a millennium, not because its ideas were necessarily superior, but because it had built an institutional structure that could preserve, transmit, and enforce those ideas across generations. If the Enlightenment was to succeed, it needed its own institution. It needed its own network. It needed, in essence, its own church, but a church of reason rather than faith. And Adam Weishaupt, trained in the methods of the very institution he sought to replace, was perfectly positioned to build it. The Bavaria of 1776 was a land caught between worlds. For decades under Maximilian III Joseph, it had been moving slowly toward Enlightenment ideals. Universities had begun teaching subjects beyond theology. Censorship had relaxed slightly. There was a sense that change was possible, that the old ways might finally give way to something new. But when Maximilian died in 1777, his successor, Charles Theodore, brought with him a very different vision. The new elector was weak-willed and easily influenced, and the forces of reaction, the nobility, the church, the remaining Jesuits, quickly moved to reclaim their lost ground. Censorship returned with a vengeance. Books were banned. Progressive professors found themselves under surveillance. It was in this atmosphere of growing repression that Weishaupt made his fateful decision. If Enlightenment ideas could not spread openly, they would have to spread in secret. If the forces of reaction controlled the universities, the churches, and the courts, then the forces of progress would have to create their own parallel institutions. Invisible, untraceable, and utterly dedicated to the transformation of human society. On May 1st, 1776, May Day, the ancient festival of renewal and rebirth, Adam Weishaupt gathered 4 of his most trusted students in a secluded room. What happened next would echo through history in ways none of them could have imagined. The meeting was carefully planned. Weishaupt had spent months selecting these particular young men, studying their characters, testing their commitment to Enlightenment ideals. He needed individuals who were intelligent enough to understand the scope of what he was proposing, brave enough to risk the consequences, and trustworthy enough to keep secrets that could cost them their lives. The first was Massenhausen, a law student whose sharp mind had caught Weishaupt's attention. He would become Ajax, named for the legendary Greek warrior. Then came Bauhoff, who would take the name Agathon after the ancient Greek tragedian. Merz became Tiberius, honoring the Roman emperor known for his administrative genius, and Sutor transformed into Erasmus Roterodamus after the great humanist scholar who had challenged the church centuries before. Weishaupt himself took the name that would become legendary, Spartacus, after the slave who had led the greatest rebellion against Roman power. The choice was deliberate and revealing. Like the historical Spartacus, Weishaupt saw himself as leading an uprising against an oppressive system. But this would not be a rebellion of swords and shields. This would be a revolution of minds. The organization they founded that night was initially called the Bund der Perfektibilisten, the Covenant of Perfectibility. The name reflected their core belief that human beings were perfectible through reason and education, that society could be reformed through the gradual spread of Enlightenment ideals. They weren't trying to destroy civilization, they were trying to perfect it. But perfection, as they would learn, was a dangerous goal. The early structure was elegantly simple. New members would be recruited carefully, their characters studied, their loyalty tested. They would advance through degrees of initiation, each level revealing more of the organization's true purposes. At the bottom were the novices, who knew only that they belonged to a society dedicated to mutual improvement and the advancement of knowledge. Above them were the Minervals, named after the Roman goddess of wisdom, who understood that the organization had deeper political goals. And at the top were the illuminated Minervals, who knew the full scope of Weishaupt's vision. Each member took a classical name, abandoning their birth identity to become part of something larger. They developed their own calendar, dating events from the year of the organization's founding. They created codes and ciphers for secret communication. Most importantly, they began the systematic study of each other's characters, compiling detailed psychological profiles that would make modern surveillance techniques seem primitive by comparison. The genius of Weishaupt's system lay not in its secrecy, but in its methodology. Unlike other secret societies that relied on mystical rituals or ancient traditions, the Illuminati operated with scientific precision. They studied human nature the way naturalists studied plants and animals. They mapped social networks with mathematical accuracy. They understood that changing the world required first understanding exactly how the world worked. But understanding the world and changing it were two very different challenges. As 1776 turned to 1777, Weishaupt faced a crucial problem. His organization was growing, but slowly. Limited to his own students and their immediate circles, the Illuminati risked remaining a small academic society rather than becoming the transformative force he envisioned. He needed to expand, but expansion meant exposure. And exposure, in the Bavaria of Charles Theodore, meant destruction. It was then that Weishaupt made a decision that would define not just his organization's future, but the entire mythology that would grow around it. If the Illuminati were to spread beyond the confines of Ingolstadt, they would need to infiltrate existing networks. They would need to hide in plain sight. They would need to become invisible builders, working within other institutions to slowly, carefully, reshape the world from within. And the perfect vehicle for this infiltration was already waiting for them. An organization with lodges across Europe, with rituals that masked deeper purposes, with members bound by oaths of secrecy and brotherhood. The Freemasons. What Weishaupt understood, and what would later fuel countless conspiracy theories, was that the most effective way to spread revolutionary ideas was not to announce them publicly, but to embed them so deeply within existing institutions that they became indistinguishable from the institutions themselves. The Illuminati would not destroy Freemasonry. They would become it, transforming it from within until its original purposes were replaced by their own. This strategy of institutional infiltration would prove brilliantly successful. It would also prove to be their downfall. Because when you teach people to see hidden patterns and secret influences everywhere, you shouldn't be surprised when they eventually start looking for those patterns in your own organization. The transformation began in 1777, when Weishaupt himself was initiated into a Masonic lodge in Munich. To the other members, he appeared to be simply another professor seeking intellectual fellowship and moral improvement. They had no way of knowing that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most sophisticated infiltration operations in history. Weishaupt studied Masonic rituals with the same systematic approach he brought to everything else. He memorized their symbols, learned their passwords, understood their hierarchies, but more importantly, he began to see how their structure could be adapted for his own purposes. The Masons already had a system of degrees and initiations. They already practiced secrecy and mutual support. They already attracted the kinds of educated, influential men the Illuminati needed to recruit. All that was required was to slowly, carefully introduce Illuminati ideas into Masonic discussions, to suggest that the true purpose of Masonry was not just moral improvement, but social transformation. To plant seeds of enlightenment, thought that would grow and spread through the existing Masonic network. It was a brilliant strategy, and it worked beyond Weishaupt's wildest dreams. Within months, Illuminati members were joining Masonic lodges across Bavaria. Within a year, they had begun to influence lodge discussions and activities. Within 2 years, they had effectively taken control of several lodges, transforming them into Illuminati recruitment centers. But success brought new challenges. As the organization grew, it attracted attention from exactly the kind of people Weishaupt had hoped to avoid: conservative nobles who saw their privileges threatened, church officials who recognized the anti-clerical nature of Illuminati teaching, government ministers who understood that an organization dedicated to perfecting society might have some very definite ideas about which aspects of the current system needed to be eliminated. The invisible builders were becoming visible, and visibility, for a secret society in 18th century Bavaria, was the beginning of the end. As 1778 dawned, Adam Weishaupt stood at the pinnacle of his achievement. His organization, now formally renamed the Order of Illuminati, had grown from 5 university students to hundreds of members across the German states. They had successfully infiltrated Masonic lodges, recruited influential nobles and intellectuals, and begun the systematic work of spreading Enlightenment ideals through European society. But success, as Weishaupt was about to learn, carried its own dangers. The very methods that had allowed the Illuminati to grow so quickly, the secrecy, the infiltration, the systematic recruitment, were about to trigger the first of many panics about secret societies that would echo through the centuries. Because when people begin to suspect that invisible forces are reshaping their world, they tend to see those forces everywhere, even where they don't exist. And once that suspicion takes root, it becomes almost impossible to distinguish between reality and paranoia, between genuine conspiracies and imaginary ones. The Illuminati had set out to perfect human society through reason and education. Instead, they were about to discover that they had created something far more powerful and far more dangerous, a template for every conspiracy theory that would follow. The dark truth about the Illuminati's origins was not that they were more sinister than anyone imagined. It was that they were exactly as effective as their enemies feared. And that effectiveness would make them the perfect scapegoat for every social upheaval, political revolution, and cultural transformation of the next 2 centuries. Tonight, as we continue our journey through the hidden corridors of history, we'll discover how a small group of Bavarian intellectuals accidentally created the most enduring conspiracy theory in human history, and why that theory refuses to die, no matter how much evidence accumulates against it. The year 1780 marked a turning point that would forever change the trajectory of Weishaupt's creation. Into the carefully ordered world of the Illuminati stepped a man whose arrival would transform them from a small Bavarian intellectual society into something approaching the global network their enemies would later claim they had always been. His name was Baron Adolf Franz Friedrich von Knigge, and he possessed exactly the combination of aristocratic connections, Masonic experience, and organizational genius that Weishaupt's vision required. But Knigge brought something else, something Weishaupt hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. He brought ambition of his own. Baron von Knigge was everything Weishaupt was not. Where the professor was methodical and cautious, Knigge was charismatic and bold. Where Weishaupt thought in terms of careful recruitment and gradual influence, Knigge envisioned rapid expansion and dramatic transformation. Most importantly, where Weishaupt saw the Illuminati as his personal creation, Knigge saw it as raw material that could be shaped into something far grander. The Baron had discovered the Illuminati through the Masonic network, exactly as Weishaupt had intended. But instead of becoming another carefully managed recruit, Knigge recognized immediately what he was looking at: an organization with unlimited potential that was being held back by its founder's academic caution. Within months of his initiation, he had begun to restructure the entire system. Under Knigge's influence, the simple 3-degree structure that had served the Illuminati's early growth exploded into a complex hierarchy of 13 degrees, divided into 3 major classes. The first class, the nursery, included the original degrees of novice, minerval, and illuminated minerval. But above them rose the Masonic class, with degrees of apprentice, fellow, and master illuminatus. and crowning the entire structure was the mysteries class, divided into lesser mysteries and greater mysteries, culminating in the degree of Rex, King. Each degree had its own rituals, its own secrets, its own carefully crafted initiation ceremonies. Nig, drawing on his extensive Masonic experience, created a system of such elaborate symbolism and psychological sophistication that it made the original Illuminati structure look like a children's game. New initiates found themselves on a journey of discovery that seemed to promise ultimate enlightenment, always just one more degree away. But the true genius of Nig's system lay not in its complexity, but in its psychology. Each degree was designed to test the candidate's readiness for greater truths, while simultaneously deepening their commitment to the organization. By the time a member reached the higher degrees, they had invested so much time, energy, and identity in the Illuminati that abandoning it would mean abandoning themselves. More sinisterly, Nig instituted a system of surveillance that would have impressed the most paranoid modern dictator. Each new member was required to compile detailed reports on their own character, listing their weaknesses, their enemies, their fears, and their desires. They had to catalogue their possessions, their reading habits, their social connections. Most chillingly, they were required to recruit their own friends and family members, turning the most intimate relationships into tools of organizational expansion. The Illuminati began to function like a vast intelligence network, with each member both a spy and a target of surveillance. They watched each other, reported on each other, and gradually surrendered their individual identities to become components in a larger machine. What had begun as a society dedicated to human perfectibility was becoming something that looked disturbingly like a cult. Under Nig's leadership, the expansion was breathtaking. The Illuminati established lodges across the German states, then beyond, into Austria, Switzerland, France, Poland, and beyond. They recruited nobles, intellectuals, government officials, and military officers. By 1784, they claimed over 2,000 members, including some of the most influential figures in European society. Among their ranks were names that would echo through history. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the greatest literary figure of the German Enlightenment, was initiated in 1783. Johann Gottfried von Herder, the philosopher whose ideas would influence everything from Romanticism to nationalism, became a member. Duke Karl August of Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach provided aristocratic protection and funding. Even the astronomer Johann Bode, who would later give his name to Bode's law describing planetary orbits, found his way into their ranks. But perhaps most significantly, they began to attract members from the highest levels of government and military. Baron Franz Xaver von Zwack became one of their most important leaders, using his position in the Bavarian civil service to protect the organization and advance its interests. Count Massimiliano di Collorat provided connections to the Austrian court. Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick offered Masonic legitimacy and international influence. The Illuminati were becoming exactly what their enemies would later claim they had always been: a shadow network of influential figures working to reshape European society according to their own vision. The only difference was that their vision was not the sinister plot of later conspiracy theories, but the rational humanitarian ideals of the Enlightenment. Yet even as they expanded, internal tensions were growing. Weishaupt watched with increasing alarm as his creation evolved beyond his control. The elaborate ceremonies and mystical symbolism that Nig had introduced seemed to violate everything the Illuminati claimed to represent. How could an organization dedicated to reason and scientific thinking base itself on theatrical rituals and manufactured mysteries? More troubling was the way the organization was changing the men who joined it. Weishaupt had envisioned creating rational individuals who would work together to improve society. Instead, he was watching intelligent, accomplished people surrender their independent judgment to follow the dictates of the organization. The surveillance system that was supposed to ensure loyalty was creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mutual suspicion. By 1783, the conflict between Weishaupt and Nigger had become irreconcilable. The Baron wanted to merge the Illuminati completely with Freemasonry, creating a unified movement that would span all of Europe. Weishaupt insisted on maintaining the organization's independence and its focus on Enlightenment principles rather than Masonic mysticism. The dispute grew so bitter that Nig eventually resigned from the organization he had done more than anyone to build. But Nigger's departure came too late to save either the Illuminati or their reputation. The very success of their expansion had made them visible to their enemies, and those enemies were numerous, well-connected, and increasingly alarmed by what they saw as a direct threat to the traditional order of European society. The Catholic Church had been watching the growth of Enlightenment ideas with growing concern for decades. The Illuminati's explicit anti-clericalism and their recruitment of influential Catholics made them a particular target. Jesuit agents, despite their order's official dissolution, maintained extensive intelligence networks and began compiling evidence of Illuminati activities. Conservative nobles, seeing their privileges questioned by Illuminati teachings about human equality and rational government, began to pressure their rulers to take action. Military officers worried about an organization that preached loyalty to universal principles rather than to king and country. Government ministers feared a network that operated across national boundaries and owed allegiance to no sovereign. Most dangerous of all were the rival secret societies that saw the Illuminati as competition. The Rosicrucians, with their mystical Christianity and alchemical traditions, viewed the rationalist Illuminati as enemies of true spirituality. The strict observance Templars, claiming descent from the medieval Knights Templar, saw them as usurpers of Masonic legitimacy. These groups had their own networks, their own influence, and their own reasons to want the Illuminati destroyed. By 1784, the net was closing. Elector Charles Theodore, under pressure from all sides, was preparing to act against secret societies in general and the Illuminati in particular. Weishaupt could sense the danger, but he had lost control of his own organization. The very methods that had made them successful, the secrecy, the infiltration, the systematic recruitment, now made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of exposure they had always feared. In June 1784, Charles Theodore issued his first edict, banning all secret societies not specifically authorized by law. The Illuminati, confident in their influence and their ability to operate undetected, initially dismissed the threat. They had survived papal bulls and noble opposition before. They controlled members in key government positions. They had weathered previous storms through careful planning and strategic patience. But this time was different. This time, their enemies were prepared not just to ban them, but to expose them. This time, the very documents and surveillance reports that had made them so effective would be turned against them. This time, the hunters had become the hunted. And when the final blow fell in March 1785, when Charles Theodore specifically named the Illuminati as a forbidden organization, the consequences would extend far beyond the borders of Bavaria. The documents that would be seized, the confessions that would be extracted, the conspiracy theories that would be born. All of this would transform the Illuminati from a historical curiosity into a permanent fixture of the human imagination. The dark truth about the Illuminati's origins was becoming clear. They had succeeded too well at their original goal of invisible influence. They had created a template so effective, so frightening in its implications, that it would outlive their actual existence by centuries. They had proven that small groups of dedicated individuals could indeed reshape the world, and in doing so, they had made everyone afraid that other small groups might be doing the same thing. The age of conspiracy theories was about to begin, and the Illuminati, in their death throes, were about to become immortal. The end came swiftly, but its echoes would reverberate for centuries. On a cold February night in 1786, Bavarian police surrounded the home of Xavier von Zwack in the town of Landshut. What they found in his private chambers would transform the Illuminati from a secret society into the most famous conspiracy theory in human history. Zwack had been careful, or so he thought. As one of the Illuminati's most senior leaders and a government official himself, he understood the importance of operational security. But the organization's own methods betrayed him. The same obsessive record-keeping that had made the Illuminati so effective also made them vulnerable when those records fell into the wrong hands. The police seized hundreds of documents, membership lists with real names and code names, detailed psychological profiles of recruits, financial records showing the flow of money across national borders, and most damaging of all, the organization's own internal correspondence. For the first time, outsiders could see exactly how the Illuminati operated, how they recruited, how they influenced, and most importantly, what they ultimately hoped to achieve. But the documents told a story more complex and more troubling than either the Illuminati's supporters or their enemies had expected. Yes, there were the Enlightenment ideals that Weishaupt had proclaimed, the commitment to reason, education, and human progress. But there were also darker elements that reflected how the organization had evolved under pressure and ambition. Among Zwack's papers were found detailed plans for a female branch of the organization, designed to infiltrate aristocratic social circles through wives and daughters of influential men. There were instructions for creating invisible ink and codes for secret communication. Most controversially, there were philosophical discussions that seemed to advocate suicide as a rational choice and atheism as the logical conclusion of Enlightenment thinking. The authorities also discovered something that would fuel conspiracy theories for generations. Evidence that the Illuminati had been systematically infiltrating other organizations, not just Masonic lodges, but universities, government departments, and even religious institutions. They had created cells within cells, networks within networks, a shadow structure that paralleled and gradually replaced the official institutions of society. When these documents were published by the Bavarian government in 1787, the reaction was explosive. Across Europe, people suddenly realized that for over a decade, an organization dedicated to fundamentally transforming their society had been operating in secret, recruiting their leaders, influencing their institutions, and working toward goals that remained largely hidden from public view. The Catholic Church, vindicated in its long-standing suspicions about secret societies, launched a massive campaign to expose and root out Illuminati influence. Conservative governments across Europe began investigating their own officials for signs of Illuminati membership. Rival secret societies, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, began publishing their own exposés of Illuminati methods and goals. But the most significant reaction came from two men whose books would define how the Illuminati were remembered for centuries to come. In 1797, natural philosopher John Robison published Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in the secret meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and Reading societies. That same year, Abbé Augustin Baruel, a former Jesuit, published his 4-volume Memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. Both men made the same explosive claim. The Illuminati had not died with the Bavarian suppression of 1785. Instead, they had survived, spread across Europe, and were responsible for the French Revolution that had begun just 4 years after their official dissolution. According to Robison and Baruel, the chaos in France, the execution of the King and Queen, the systematic destruction of the Catholic Church, and the export of revolutionary ideals across Europe. All of this was the result of a carefully orchestrated Illuminati plot. The evidence for this claim was thin to non-existent. Neither author could establish any meaningful connection between the Bavarian Illuminati and French revolutionaries. The timeline didn't work. The organization had been effectively destroyed years before the revolution began. The methods didn't match. The French Revolution was chaotic, violent and public, everything the methodical, secretive Illuminati would have avoided. But evidence was less important than narrative. The idea that the French Revolution was not the spontaneous uprising of an oppressed people, but the calculated manipulation of a secret society, appealed to conservatives who could not otherwise explain how the seemingly stable order of European monarchy had collapsed so suddenly and completely. More importantly, Robison and Baruel had created a template that could be applied to any social upheaval, political change, or cultural transformation. If secret societies could orchestrate something as massive as the French Revolution, what else might they be responsible for? What other changes in society might be the result of hidden manipulation rather than natural development? The Illuminati conspiracy theory was born, and with it, a new way of understanding history, not as the result of economic forces, social tensions, or cultural evolution, but as the product of secret manipulation by hidden elites. This interpretation would prove remarkably durable, adaptable to any era and any political system. In the early 19th century, American politicians blamed the Illuminati for everything from the War of 1812 to the establishment of the Second Bank of the United States. The Anti-Masonic Party, one of America's first third parties, was founded specifically to combat what they saw as Illuminati influence in American politics. When industrialization disrupted traditional society, critics pointed to secret society manipulation. When nationalism challenged old empires, conspiracy theorists saw the hidden hand of international secret societies. By the 20th century, the Illuminati had become a universal explanation for unwelcome change. Fascists blamed them for both capitalism and communism, claiming they were a Jewish conspiracy to control the world through economic manipulation. Communists saw them as a capitalist conspiracy to prevent worker revolution. Cold War paranoids on both sides found evidence of Illuminati influence in their enemies' successes. The irony was perfect and terrible. Adam Weishaupt had created the Illuminati to spread Enlightenment ideals, reason, evidence, scientific thinking. Instead, his organization's legacy became the ultimate triumph of unreason, a conspiracy theory that could explain any event without requiring any evidence, that could survive any debunking by simply adapting to new circumstances. The real Illuminati had been destroyed in 1785, its leaders scattered, its documents seized, its influence eliminated. But the mythical Illuminati, born from the misinterpretation of those seized documents, proved immortal. Every generation rediscovered them, reinterpreted them, and found in them confirmation of their own fears about hidden power and secret manipulation. Today, in our digital age, the Illuminati conspiracy theory has found new life. Pop stars are accused of Illuminati membership based on hand gestures in music videos. Politicians are suspected of secret society connections based on university affiliations. Global events are explained as Illuminati plots based on numerical coincidences and symbolic interpretations. The dark truth about the Illuminati's origins is not that they were more powerful than anyone imagined, but that they were exactly powerful enough to prove that secret societies could work. And in proving that, they made everyone afraid that other secret societies might be working in ways they couldn't see or understand. Adam Weishaupt died in 1830, 45 years after his organization's destruction, living long enough to see his creation transformed into something he would never have recognized. He had set out to perfect human reason and ended up creating humanity's most irrational fear. He had tried to bring light to the world and instead had cast shadows that would never fully lift. The Illuminati's true legacy is not the conspiracy theories that bear their name, but the lesson they taught about the power of organization, the danger of secrecy, and the terrible responsibility that comes with trying to reshape the world. They proved that small groups of dedicated individuals could indeed change history. And in doing so, they made sure that no one would ever again be able to change history without someone wondering if they were part of a conspiracy. As we drift towards sleep tonight, surrounded by the gentle darkness that makes all conspiracy theories seem possible, perhaps we can find comfort in this truth. The real Illuminati were not the puppet masters of legend, but human beings like ourselves, with noble goals and fatal flaws, who learned too late that the most dangerous thing you can do is succeed too well at something the world isn't ready to understand. Their story is our story, the eternal human struggle between the desire to improve the world and the fear of those who would improve it. In that struggle, there are no villains, only people trying to build something better and discovering that the very act of building can become a source of terror for those who prefer the world as it is. The Illuminati's origins may be dark, but their truth is deeply human, and perhaps that's the most frightening revelation of all. But the destruction of the historical Illuminati marked not an ending, but a beginning. Like seeds scattered by a violent wind, the ideas and methods that Weishaupt had perfected would take root in soil he never could have imagined. The very act of suppressing his organization had made it legendary, and legends, as any student of human nature knows, are far more powerful than facts. In the decades following 1785, something remarkable began to happen across Europe and beyond. Secret societies proliferated like never before, each claiming to possess ancient wisdom, each promising to initiate members into profound mysteries, each operating with methods that bore an uncanny resemblance to Weishaupt's original design. The Illuminati template had been released into the world, and it proved remarkably adaptable. Consider the explosion of occult societies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Ordo Templi Orientis, the Theosophical Society, all emerged with hierarchical degree systems, elaborate initiation rituals, and claims to possess secret knowledge that could transform both individual consciousness and society itself. Their founders had studied the seized Illuminati documents, learning not just what Weishaupt had done wrong, but what he had done brilliantly right. The genius of the Illuminati system lay not in its specific goals, but in its psychological architecture. Weishaupt had understood that human beings crave meaning, purpose, and the sense of being part of something larger than themselves. He had recognized that people will endure extraordinary hardships and make tremendous sacrifices if they believe they are working toward a transcendent goal. Most importantly, he had discovered that the most effective way to control behavior was not through force or fear, but through the careful management of information and identity. These insights proved applicable far beyond the narrow confines of Enlightenment philosophy. Revolutionary movements across Europe began adopting Illuminati-style cell structures, where members knew only their immediate contacts and operated under assumed names. The Carbonari in Italy, Young Germany, the Decembrists in Russia, all borrowed elements from Weishaupt's organizational blueprint. Even more significantly, legitimate governments began studying Illuminati methods for their own purposes. The modern intelligence service, with its networks of assets, its compartmentalized information, and its techniques for psychological manipulation, owes more to Adam Weishaupt than most intelligence officers would care to admit. The Illuminati had pioneered the systematic study of human psychology for organizational purposes, creating detailed profiles of potential recruits and using those profiles to determine exactly how to approach, influence, and ultimately control them. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Illuminati was not their organizational methods, but their approach to social change itself. Weishaupt had rejected both violent revolution and open political advocacy in favor of something far more subtle and potentially more effective: the gradual transformation of culture through the patient work of infiltrating and influencing existing institutions. This strategy would be rediscovered and refined by movements across the political spectrum. Communist parties would use it to penetrate labor unions, universities, and media organizations. Corporate interests would employ similar techniques to influence regulatory agencies and academic research. Religious movements would apply these methods to spread their beliefs through seemingly secular institutions. The technique itself was morally neutral. It could serve any cause and promote any ideology. What mattered was not the specific beliefs being advanced, but the systematic nature of the approach. Identify key institutions and influential individuals. Study their psychological profiles and organizational dynamics. Develop long-term strategies for gradual influence rather than dramatic confrontation. Work patiently over years or decades to shift the culture from within. This was Weishaupt's true innovation, and it would prove far more revolutionary than any political program he had advocated. He had discovered that in a complex society, real power belonged not to those who held official positions, but to those who could influence how people thought about those positions. The Illuminati had failed because they had been exposed before their cultural transformation was complete. But the lesson was clear. Succeed at changing how people think, and political change would follow inevitably. By the mid-19th century, this insight had been absorbed by reformers and revolutionaries around the world. The abolition movement in America used Illuminati-style networks to coordinate activities across state lines while maintaining plausible deniability. The women's suffrage movement employed similar techniques to gradually shift public opinion about female political participation. Labor organizers created cell-based structures that could survive government crackdowns and continue their work underground. What made this development particularly fascinating was that most of these movements had no direct connection to the historical Illuminati. They were reinventing Weishaupt's methods independently, discovering through trial and error the same organizational principles he had pioneered. The Illuminati template had become part of the cultural DNA of modern political action, transmitted not through direct instruction, but through the simple logic of what worked and what didn't. Yet even as these methods spread and evolved, the mythological Illuminati continued to grow in the popular imagination. Every successful reform movement, every social transformation, every shift in cultural values became potential evidence of ongoing Illuminati activity. The conspiracy theory had achieved something remarkable. It had become self-reinforcing. The more effectively people used Illuminati-style methods to create change, the more credible the conspiracy theory became. This created a strange paradox. The most effective way to create social change was to use methods pioneered by the Illuminati, but using those methods inevitably generated suspicion that one was part of an Illuminati conspiracy. Any organization that succeeded at gradual, systematic influence would eventually be accused of being a front for the very secret society that had pioneered such techniques. The paranoia was not entirely unjustified. By the early 20th century, there were indeed networks of influence that operated with Illuminati-like sophistication. The Rhodes Scholarship Program created an international network of young leaders who shared certain political and cultural assumptions. The Bohemian Grove brought together business and political elites in an atmosphere of ritualized bonding and informal coordination. Organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission facilitated quiet cooperation among influential individuals across national boundaries. Were these organizations the Illuminati reborn? The question itself revealed the problem with conspiracy thinking. These groups operated openly, published membership lists, and held public events. Their influence was real, but entirely visible to anyone willing to pay attention. They were exactly what they appeared to be: networks of like-minded individuals working together to advance shared interests and values. But in a world conditioned to see hidden manipulation behind every social change, transparency was no defense against suspicion. The more openly these organizations operated, the more their openness seemed like a cover for deeper secrets. The more they explained their activities, the more their explanations seemed like carefully crafted deceptions. This dynamic would intensify throughout the 20th century as mass media made it possible to reach larger audiences with conspiracy theories, while simultaneously making it easier to document the real activities of influential organizations. The result was a strange inversion of the original Illuminati story. Where Weishaupt had worked in secret to advance Enlightenment ideals of reason and transparency, his mythological successors were accused of working in secret to suppress those same ideals. The Cold War provided perfect conditions for this paranoid worldview to flourish. Both sides saw hidden enemies everywhere, and both developed sophisticated techniques for information warfare and psychological manipulation. When the Soviet Union collapsed and classified documents began to emerge, they revealed extensive networks of influence and infiltration that had operated for decades without public knowledge. The revelation that some conspiracy theories had been essentially correct made all conspiracy theories seem more plausible. Meanwhile, the rise of global capitalism created new forms of international coordination that bore striking resemblances to the networks the Illuminati had pioneered. Multinational corporations operated across national boundaries, shared information and strategies, and worked to influence government policies in multiple countries simultaneously. International financial institutions could affect the fate of entire nations through decisions made in private meetings by small groups of unelected officials. These developments were not secret. They were reported in newspapers and analyzed by scholars. But their complexity made them difficult for ordinary citizens to understand, and their consequences often seemed disconnected from democratic input or control. In such an environment, it was natural for people to wonder if there were hidden hands guiding these seemingly impersonal forces. The internet age would bring this dynamic to its logical conclusion. Digital technologies made it easier than ever to coordinate activities across vast networks while maintaining privacy and security. They also made it possible for anyone to research and publicize the connections between different organizations and individuals. The result was an explosion of both actual networks and theories about secret networks. Social media platforms, search algorithms, and recommendation systems created new forms of influence that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. People's beliefs and behaviors were being shaped by systems they couldn't see or understand, using psychological techniques that would have impressed Adam Weishaupt. The technology companies that built these systems operated with levels of secrecy that would have made the original Illuminati envious. Yet when critics pointed out these developments, they were often dismissed as conspiracy theorists, lumped in with people who believed in lizard people and flat earth theories. The term Illuminati had become so associated with paranoid delusion that it was almost impossible to have a rational discussion about actual networks of influence and coordination. This was perhaps the most perverse legacy of Weishaupt's creation. By becoming the ultimate symbol of conspiracy thinking, the Illuminati had made it nearly impossible to discuss real conspiracies. Any attempt to analyze how power actually worked in modern society risked being dismissed as Illuminati conspiracy theory, even when the analysis was based on publicly available information and followed standard academic methodology. The original Illuminati had sought to promote reason and critical thinking. Their mythological descendants had made critical thinking about power structures almost impossible by contaminating the entire subject with associations of paranoid irrationality. It was a perfect example of how good intentions, pursued through questionable methods, could produce consequences opposite to those intended. As the 21st century progressed, this dynamic would only intensify. The same technologies that made global coordination easier also made it easier to spread conspiracy theories about that coordination. The same networks that connected legitimate organizations also connected believers in various alternative theories about how the world really worked. In this environment, the line between reality and fantasy became increasingly blurred. Real networks of influence operated alongside imaginary ones in the collective consciousness. Actual coordination between powerful individuals and organizations was interpreted through frameworks derived from fictional accounts of secret society manipulation. The dark truth about the Illuminati's origins had become clear. Adam Weishaupt had not created a conspiracy to control the world. He had created something far more powerful and far more dangerous. A template for understanding power that would make it almost impossible for anyone to exercise power effectively without being accused of conspiracy, while simultaneously making it almost impossible to recognize and respond to actual abuses of power. The Illuminati's real legacy was not world domination, but world confusion, a permanent state of uncertainty about who was really in control, what they really wanted, and whether anything that happened in public bore any relationship to what was happening in private. In trying to bring light to the world, Weishaupt had instead created a darkness that would prove far more enduring than any institution he could have built. And in that darkness, conspiracy theories would flourish like mushrooms after rain, feeding on fear and uncertainty, growing larger and more elaborate with each passing generation, until the truth about the Illuminati's origins would be almost completely buried beneath layers of myth, speculation, and deliberate disinformation. The greatest irony was that this outcome had been entirely predictable. Weishaupt himself had understood the power of secrecy to generate suspicion and paranoia. He had simply believed that he could control and direct that paranoia for beneficial purposes. Like so many intelligent people before and since, he had underestimated the tendency of complex systems to develop in ways their creators never intended or anticipated. The Illuminati's story was not unique, it was emblematic. Every attempt to reshape society through secret coordination would face the same fundamental problem. Success would generate suspicion, suspicion would generate opposition, and opposition would ultimately transform the original mission beyond recognition. The very methods that made such organizations effective also made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of mythologization that had transformed Weishaupt's rational society into the ultimate symbol of irrational fear. Tonight, as we prepare for sleep in a world still haunted by the shadows the Illuminati cast centuries ago, we might reflect on this sobering truth. The greatest dangers often come not from those who seek to harm us, but from those who seek to help us in ways we cannot see or understand. The road to conspiracy theory, like the road to hell, is paved with good intentions and lined with the unintended consequences of actions taken in darkness, however noble their original purpose might have been. As the 19th century dawned, the scattered remnants of Weishaupt's organization had long since dissolved into the mists of history, yet something peculiar began to emerge from the ruins. Not the resurrection of the Illuminati themselves, but the birth of something far more insidious and enduring. The very act of destroying them had made them immortal. In drawing rooms across Europe, in coffee houses from Vienna to London, in the salons of Paris where revolutionary fervor still smoldered, people whispered questions that had never been asked before. If one secret society could infiltrate governments and universities so successfully, how many others might be operating undetected? If intelligent men could be so systematically deceived about the true nature of their colleagues, what other deceptions might be flourishing in plain sight? The psychological impact of the Illuminati revelations extended far beyond their actual membership or influence. For the first time in European history, ordinary citizens had been forced to confront the possibility that their social reality was not what it appeared to be. The institutions they trusted, the leaders they followed, the very framework of their society. All of it might be theatre, carefully orchestrated by unseen hands for purposes they could not fathom. This realization created what scholars would later recognize as the first modern conspiracy panic. Unlike the witch hunts and religious persecutions of earlier centuries, this was not about supernatural threats or theological heresies. This was about the far more terrifying possibility that rational, educated human beings could systematically deceive their contemporaries while advancing hidden agendas that might fundamentally transform civilization itself. The timing could not have been more perfect for such fears to take root and flourish. The French Revolution had shattered the illusion of social stability, that had defined European life for centuries. Ancient monarchies had crumbled overnight. The Catholic Church had seen its properties seized and its authority challenged. Traditional hierarchies of birth and privilege had given way to new forms of organization based on merit, ideology, and political loyalty. To conservative minds struggling to comprehend these upheavals, the Illuminati provided a comforting explanation. The chaos was not random. It was planned. The destruction was not inevitable. It was orchestrated. The future was not uncertain. It was being shaped by a small group of conspirators working according to a predetermined script. This interpretation had the virtue of making the incomprehensible seem manageable. If secret societies were responsible for social change, then identifying and suppressing those societies might prevent further change. If hidden conspiracies were reshaping the world, then exposing those conspiracies might restore the old order. The alternative, accepting that massive social transformations could emerge from the complex interaction of economic, cultural, and political forces beyond any individual's control, was far more frightening than any conspiracy theory. But the conservative reaction to the Illuminati threat created an unexpected problem. In their eagerness to root out secret society influence, authorities began to see that influence everywhere. Every reform movement became suspect. Every intellectual gathering might be a cover for conspiracy. Every friendship between influential individuals might mask a deeper coordination. The result was a systematic persecution of exactly the kind of rational, educated discourse that the Enlightenment had promoted. Universities found their faculties under surveillance. Scientific societies were investigated for signs of political subversion. Literary clubs were monitored for seditious discussions. The very intellectual networks that had produced the scientific and cultural achievements of the 18th century came under suspicion as potential vehicles for conspiracy. This created a perverse dynamic that would echo through the centuries. The more vigorously authorities searched for secret societies, the more they drove legitimate intellectual and political activity underground. The more they suppressed open discussion of social problems, the more they encouraged the formation of actual secret networks. Their efforts to prevent conspiracy had the effect of making conspiracy more likely. Meanwhile, the published Illuminati documents continued to circulate, studied not only by their enemies, but by anyone interested in understanding how small groups could exercise disproportionate influence. Revolutionaries and reformers found, in Weishaupt's methods, a blueprint for organizing effective opposition movements. Conservative politicians discovered techniques for building and maintaining networks of loyal supporters. Religious leaders learned new approaches to converting and indoctrinating followers. The irony was exquisite. The Illuminati's greatest success was not in advancing their original goals, but in teaching everyone else how to organize more effectively. Their methods became part of the standard toolkit of anyone seeking to create social change, regardless of their specific objectives or ideology. This democratization of conspiracy techniques had profound implications for how power would operate in the modern world. No longer was effective organization the monopoly of established institutions like the church, the military, or hereditary aristocracy. Anyone with sufficient intelligence, patience, and dedication could potentially build networks capable of influencing events far beyond their apparent size or resources. The transformation was visible across Europe as the 19th century progressed. Nationalist movements used cell-based structures to coordinate resistance against imperial authorities. Labor organizers employed systematic recruitment techniques to build unions that could challenge industrial power. Religious revival movements developed sophisticated methods for spreading their beliefs through existing social networks. Each of these developments was rational and comprehensible in its own context. Workers had legitimate grievances against exploitative employers. Ethnic minorities had understandable desires for self-determination. Religious communities naturally sought to share their beliefs with others. None of these movements required secret conspiracy to explain their emergence or success. Yet the existence of the Illuminati template made it almost impossible to view any of these developments as purely organic. Every successful movement was suspected of being more organized, more coordinated, more deliberately manipulative than it appeared. The very effectiveness of these groups became evidence that they must be following some hidden blueprint for social transformation. This suspicion was not entirely unfounded. Many movement leaders had indeed studied historical examples of successful organization, including the Illuminati documents. They had learned from Weishaupt's successes and failures, adapting his methods to their own circumstances and objectives. But this conscious borrowing of techniques was very different from being part of an ongoing conspiracy descended from the original organization. The distinction, however, was lost on most observers. The similarity of methods was taken as evidence of continuity of purpose. The fact that different movements use comparable organizational structures was interpreted as proof that they were all part of the same larger conspiracy. The Illuminati myth had created a lens through which any effective organization looked suspicious. This paranoid interpretation reached its first great climax in the aftermath of the revolutions of 1848. Across Europe, popular uprisings challenged established governments, demanding constitutional reforms, national independence, and democratic representation. The movements were largely spontaneous, emerging from specific local grievances and spreading through networks of communication that were entirely visible to anyone paying attention. But conservative commentators, traumatized by the speed and coordination of these upheavals, immediately began searching for hidden hands behind the chaos. Surely such widespread revolutionary activity could not have emerged naturally. Surely there must be secret societies coordinating these seemingly independent movements. Surely the Illuminati, or their successors, must be orchestrating this assault on traditional authority. The search for conspiracy became a European obsession. Government agents infiltrated universities, political clubs, and social organizations. Police compiled lists of suspected secret society members based on their associations, their reading habits, and their expressed opinions. Postal services monitored correspondence for coded messages. Border authorities watched for suspicious travelers who might be carrying revolutionary instructions. These investigations occasionally uncovered genuine conspiracies, small groups of revolutionaries who were indeed coordinating across national boundaries. But they also revealed something more significant and more troubling. The very act of searching for conspiracies was creating them. When open political activity became dangerous, reformers naturally turned to secret methods. When normal channels for social change were blocked, alternative networks inevitably emerged. The authorities' obsession with secret societies was producing exactly what they feared most: a world where legitimate political activity was increasingly driven underground, where trust between citizens and governments eroded, where the line between legal dissent and treasonous conspiracy became increasingly blurred. By the middle of the 19th century, this dynamic had created a new kind of political culture across Europe. Public discourse became increasingly stylized and cautious as speakers learned to avoid topics that might attract unwanted attention. Real political discussion moved to private settings, homes, clubs, informal gatherings, where people could speak more freely, but always with the awareness that informants might be present. This privatization of political life had profound consequences for democratic development. Citizens learned to distrust their own institutions, to assume that hidden agendas lay behind public policies, to interpret every government action as potentially part of some larger, undisclosed strategy. The transparency and rational debate that Enlightenment thinkers had seen as essential to good governance became increasingly rare. At the same time, the continuing circulation of conspiracy theories created a market for alternative explanations of current events. Publishers discovered that books exposing secret society influence sold far better than conventional political analysis. Newspapers found that readers were eager for stories about hidden connections between public figures. Lecture circuits developed around speakers who claimed to possess inside knowledge about how the world really worked. This emerging conspiracy culture had its own logic and its own leaders, many of whom were sincere believers in their theories rather than cynical manipulators. They saw themselves as truth-tellers, brave enough to reveal uncomfortable realities that others preferred to ignore. They developed sophisticated techniques for interpreting public events as evidence of hidden manipulation, finding patterns and connections that seemed to confirm their theories regardless of what actually happened. The most successful conspiracy theorists learned to adapt their explanations to changing circumstances. When their predicted catastrophes failed to materialize, they revised their timelines. When their alleged conspirators died or fell from power, they identified new leaders of the same conspiracy. When historical evidence contradicted their claims, they explained the contradictions as evidence of how thoroughly the conspiracy had corrupted the historical record. This adaptability made conspiracy theories remarkably resilient. Unlike scientific theories, which could be disproven by contrary evidence, conspiracy theories could incorporate any new information as confirmation of their basic premises. The absence of evidence became evidence of how successful the conspiracy was at hiding its traces. The presence of contradictory evidence became proof of how sophisticated the conspiracy's disinformation campaign had become. By the time the 19th century drew to a close, the Illuminati conspiracy theory had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to Adam Weishaupt. What had begun as a specific claim about a particular organization had become a general framework for understanding all of human history as the product of secret manipulation by hidden elites. This framework would prove infinitely adaptable to new circumstances and new fears. In the industrial age, it would be applied to capitalist exploitation and labor unrest. In the nationalist era, it would explain ethnic conflicts and imperial competition. In the democratic period, it would account for electoral outcomes and policy decisions. In the global age, it would encompass everything from economic integration to cultural change. Each generation would rediscover the Illuminati conspiracy theory and adapt it to their own anxieties, their own enemies, their own incomprehensible social changes. The specific details would evolve, but the basic structure would remain constant. A small group of powerful individuals working in secret to reshape the world according to their own vision, using methods so sophisticated that their influence was almost impossible to detect or counter. The dark truth about the Illuminati's origins had become completely obscured by this mythological transformation. The rational professors and students who had gathered in Ingolstadt to discuss Enlightenment philosophy had been replaced in the popular imagination by an eternal conspiracy of nearly supernatural power and malevolence. The specific historical context that had given rise to Weishaupt's organization, the intellectual ferment of the late 18th century, the political repression of Bavarian absolutism, the particular tensions between reason and faith that characterized the Enlightenment, had been forgotten in favor of a timeless narrative of secret manipulation. Yet perhaps this transformation was itself a kind of historical truth. Perhaps the real significance of the Illuminati was not what they had actually done, but what their existence had revealed about the human capacity for both coordination and paranoia. Perhaps their true legacy was not any specific influence they had exercised, but their demonstration that in a complex society, the mere possibility of hidden influence was enough to fundamentally alter how people understood their world. As the 20th century approached, bringing with it new technologies of communication and coordination, new forms of international organization, and new possibilities for both genuine conspiracy and paranoid interpretation, the lessons of the Illuminati experience would prove more relevant than ever. The shadows they had cast in the 18th century would grow longer and darker until they covered the entire landscape of modern political life. The age of conspiracy thinking was not ending. It was just beginning. and at its heart would always lie the question that Adam Weishaupt had unwittingly raised. In a world where small groups of dedicated individuals could indeed change the course of history, how could anyone ever be certain that such groups were not working in secret all around them? The answer, as the coming centuries would demonstrate, was that they could not be certain, and that uncertainty would reshape human civilization in ways far more profound than any actual conspiracy ever could. As the 20th century dawned, the Illuminati conspiracy theory stood poised to undergo its most dramatic transformation yet. What had begun as a specific historical claim about a defunct Bavarian organization was about to become something unprecedented in human history, a universal explanation for the modern world's bewildering complexity. The new century brought with it changes that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. Telegraph lines now carried messages across continents in minutes rather than months. Steamships and railways had compressed distance and time beyond recognition. Newspapers could spread information or misinformation to millions of people simultaneously. For the first time in human history, events in one corner of the world could instantly affect conditions everywhere else. This unprecedented interconnectedness created unprecedented anxieties. When economic panics in London triggered bank failures in New York, when political upheavals in St. Petersburg influenced revolutionary movements in Berlin, when cultural innovations in Paris shaped intellectual life in Buenos Aires, ordinary people found themselves at the mercy of forces they could not see, understand, or control. The Illuminati conspiracy theory provided a framework for making sense of this chaos. Instead of accepting that the modern world was simply too complex for any individual or group to fully comprehend, believers could imagine that somewhere, hidden from view, wise and powerful conspirators were orchestrating events according to a master plan. The alternative, that humanity was stumbling blindly toward an uncertain future, buffeted by impersonal forces and unintended consequences, was far more terrifying than any conspiracy. This psychological appeal would prove crucial to the theory's survival and evolution. As the 20th century progressed and the pace of change accelerated, more and more people would find comfort in the idea that someone, somewhere, was in control, even if that someone was their enemy. The first major test of this evolving conspiracy framework came with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The conflict's origins were genuinely complex, involving decades of imperial competition, ethnic nationalism, military alliances, and diplomatic miscalculation. No single individual or organization had planned or desired the catastrophic war that ultimately claimed millions of lives and reshaped the global order. But to many observers, such complexity was itself suspicious. How could such a massive conflict emerge from seemingly random events? How could the great powers of Europe stumble into mutual destruction without some hidden hand guiding them toward disaster? Surely the war must be serving someone's interests. But whose? Conspiracy theorists quickly identified their suspects. Some blamed international bankers who supposedly profited from financing both sides of the conflict. Others pointed to arms manufacturers who benefited from increased military spending. Still others suggested that secret societies were using the war to weaken traditional institutions and pave the way for world government. Each of these theories contained elements of truth wrapped in layers of speculation and paranoia. International finance did play a crucial role in funding the war effort. Arms manufacturers did indeed profit from military contracts. Secret societies and revolutionary movements did exploit wartime chaos to advance their agendas. But the leap from these observable facts to comprehensive conspiracy theories required a kind of logical gymnastics that would become increasingly common as the century progressed. The Russian Revolution of 1917 provided an even more dramatic example of how conspiracy thinking could distort historical understanding. The Bolshevik seizure of power was indeed the result of careful planning and organization by a small group of dedicated revolutionaries. But when Western observers tried to explain how such a momentous event could have been orchestrated by what appeared to be a marginal political movement, many turned to familiar conspiracy frameworks. Surely Lenin and his associates must have been agents of some larger conspiracy. Surely the revolution must have been financed and directed by hidden powers seeking to destroy Christian civilization. The fact that many Bolshevik leaders were Jewish provided a convenient target for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, while their international connections suggested the involvement of secret societies operating across national boundaries. These interpretations ignored the actual historical context that had made the revolution possible: the military disasters, economic collapse, and political incompetence that had discredited the Tsarist regime. They also overlooked the genuine ideological commitment that motivated the revolutionaries, reducing complex political and social movements to simple manipulation by hidden puppet masters. But conspiracy theories were not confined to conservative critics of revolution. Revolutionary movements themselves increasingly adopted conspiratorial interpretations of their enemies' behavior. If capitalist governments opposed their activities, it must be because those governments were controlled by an international conspiracy of financial interests. If working-class movements failed to achieve their goals, it must be because secret agents had infiltrated and sabotaged them from within. This mutual paranoia created a vicious cycle that would characterize much of 20th century politics. Each side's belief in enemy conspiracies justified their own secretive and manipulative behavior, which in turn provided evidence for their opponents' conspiracy theories. The result was a political culture increasingly dominated by suspicion, deception, and the assumption that nothing was as it appeared to be. The interwar period saw this dynamic reach new heights of sophistication and malevolence. In Germany, Adolf Hitler built his political career on conspiracy theories that blamed the country's defeat in World War I on a stab in the back by Jewish conspirators. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin used similar logic to justify the systematic persecution of anyone suspected of disloyalty to the regime. In both cases, the supposed existence of vast conspiracies became the justification for actual conspiracies of unprecedented scope and brutality. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated document purporting to reveal a Jewish conspiracy for world domination, became one of the most influential texts of the era, despite being thoroughly debunked by serious scholars. The document drew heavily on earlier conspiracy theories, including claims about Illuminati influence, weaving them together into a narrative that seemed to explain everything from economic instability to cultural change. What made the protocols particularly dangerous was not their originality. Most of their content was plagiarized from earlier fictional works, but their adaptability. The document could be interpreted to explain any unwelcome development in any society. Economic problems, Jewish conspiracy, political upheaval, Jewish conspiracy. Cultural innovation, Jewish conspiracy. The circular logic was perfect and impermeable to contradiction. Similar conspiracy theories emerged to explain other social changes. When women demanded political equality, critics claimed they were being manipulated by secret societies seeking to destroy traditional family structures. When colonial subjects demanded independence, imperial authorities suggested they were being incited by international communist conspiracies. When artists and intellectuals challenged conventional values, conservatives accused them of being part of a coordinated assault on Western civilization. Each of these theories contained the same basic structure that had emerged from the original Illuminati scare. A small group of conspirators was working in secret to fundamentally transform society, using methods so sophisticated that their influence was almost impossible to detect. The specific identity of the conspirators might change: Jews, communists, capitalists, secret societies, but the basic framework remained constant. This consistency was not accidental. The conspiracy theory framework had proven so useful for explaining unwelcome change that it had become a standard feature of political discourse. Politicians found that blaming secret conspiracies was easier than addressing complex social problems. Intellectuals discovered that conspiracy theories provided simple explanations for complicated phenomena. Ordinary citizens learned that attributing their difficulties to hidden enemies was more psychologically satisfying than accepting responsibility for their own circumstances. The rise of mass media in the early 20th century accelerated this process by making it possible to spread conspiracy theories to unprecedented audiences. Radio broadcasts could reach millions of listeners simultaneously. Cinema could make conspiracy narratives seem viscerally real through dramatic storytelling. Mass circulation newspapers and magazines could present conspiracy theories alongside legitimate news, blurring the distinction between fact and speculation. Technology also provided new tools for conspiracy theorists to support their claims. Photographs could be manipulated to suggest connections that didn't exist. Documents could be forged with increasing sophistication. Statistical data could be selectively presented to support predetermined conclusions. The same innovations that made genuine investigation easier also made deception more convincing. By the 1930s, conspiracy thinking had become so pervasive that it was affecting international relations and domestic policy in dangerous ways. Countries increasingly viewed their neighbors' actions through the lens of suspected conspiracy. Diplomatic initiatives were interpreted as covers for hidden agendas. Trade relationships were seen as vehicles for economic manipulation. Cultural exchanges were viewed as opportunities for ideological infiltration. This paranoid atmosphere made genuine cooperation increasingly difficult, while providing justification for aggressive and preemptive actions. If other countries were plotting against you, then striking first was merely self-defense. If international organizations were vehicles for conspiracy, then withdrawing from them was patriotic. If foreign influences were corrupting your society, then isolating yourself was necessary for survival. The outbreak of World War II represented both the culmination of this conspiratorial thinking and its ultimate refutation. The war was indeed the result of genuine conspiracies. Hitler's aggressive expansionism, Stalin's territorial ambitions, Japan's imperial designs. But these were not the shadowy, all-powerful conspiracies of popular imagination. They were the products of specific political movements operating within particular historical contexts, pursuing goals that were often openly stated and always comprehensible in terms of traditional power politics. More importantly, the war demonstrated the limits of conspiracy as an organizational principle. Despite their initial successes, the Axis powers ultimately failed because conspiracy thinking made them increasingly isolated, paranoid, and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Their obsession with hidden enemies prevented them from accurately assessing their real strategic situation, while their secretive and authoritarian methods made it impossible to harness the creative energies of their own populations. The Allied victory suggested that open societies, despite their apparent chaos and inefficiency, possessed advantages that closed conspiracies could not match. Democratic institutions might be slow and messy, but they were also flexible and resilient. Free markets might be unpredictable and sometimes unfair, but they were also innovative and productive. Academic and scientific communities might seem disorganized and contentious, but they were also capable of remarkable achievements when allowed to operate without ideological constraints. Yet even this apparent vindication of open society did not eliminate conspiracy thinking. Instead, it transformed it. During the Cold War that followed World War II, both sides developed increasingly sophisticated theories about their opponents' hidden activities. The existence of genuine espionage networks and covert operations provided a foundation of reality on which ever more elaborate conspiracy theories could be built. The development of nuclear weapons added a new dimension of urgency to these fears. For the first time in human history, small groups of individuals possessed the power to destroy civilization itself. This terrifying reality made even the most paranoid conspiracy theories seem plausible by comparison. If a few dozen people could end human civilization with the push of a button, what other powers might small conspiracies possess? The space race, the development of computer technology, the emergence of multinational corporations, the growth of international organizations. Each of these developments provided new evidence for those inclined to see conspiracy everywhere. The world was indeed becoming more interconnected and more complex, with decisions made in one location affecting conditions everywhere else. But this interconnectedness was largely the result of technological and economic forces rather than deliberate coordination by hidden elites. The distinction, however, was lost on many observers. The fact that a small number of people could indeed influence global events was taken as proof that they were doing so according to some master plan. The complexity of modern systems was interpreted as evidence of deliberate design rather than emergent properties of natural evolution. By the 1960s, this confusion between correlation and causation had become endemic in political discourse. Every major event was analyzed for signs of conspiracy. Every coincidence was treated as evidence of coordination. Every example of influence was assumed to be part of some larger pattern of manipulation. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 marked a watershed moment in the evolution of conspiracy thinking. The official investigation concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone, but many Americans found this explanation unsatisfying. How could such a momentous event be the result of one disturbed individual's actions? Surely there must be more to the story. The proliferation of alternative theories about the Kennedy assassination demonstrated how conspiracy thinking had evolved since the 18th century. Where earlier conspiracy theories had focused on specific organizations with identifiable goals, the Kennedy theories were more diffuse and speculative. Some blamed the CIA, others the mafia, still others a combination of government agencies, military contractors, and foreign powers. What united these diverse theories was not their specific claims, but their shared assumption that the official explanation was inadequate. The complexity and importance of the event required a correspondingly complex explanation. Random violence by a lone gunman was simply too simple, too meaningless, too chaotic to account for such a significant historical moment. This preference for complex explanations over simple ones would become a defining characteristic of modern conspiracy thinking. As society became more complex and interconnected, people increasingly expected explanations that matched that complexity. The idea that major events could have simple causes, that wars could start because of miscommunication, that economic crashes could result from herd psychology, that social movements could emerge spontaneously from shared grievances became increasingly difficult to accept. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s provided another test case for conspiracy thinking. To many white Americans, the sudden emergence of organized black resistance to segregation seemed suspicious. How had previously passive populations suddenly become so well organized and militant? Surely they must be receiving outside assistance, perhaps from communist agitators or other subversive influences. These suspicions ignored the long history of black resistance to oppression and the genuine grievances that motivated the civil rights movement. They also overlooked the movement's largely open and democratic character, with most of its activities conducted in public and its goals clearly stated. But the assumption that effective organization must be the result of hidden manipulation was so deeply ingrained that many observers found it impossible to accept that oppressed people could organize themselves without outside direction. Similar patterns emerged with other social movements of the era. The anti-war movement, the feminist movement, the environmental movement, all were accused of being secretly controlled by radical conspiracies seeking to undermine American society. The fact that these movements had genuine grievances and operated largely through democratic processes was less important to critics than their apparent coordination and effectiveness. This tendency to interpret effective political organization as evidence of conspiracy would have profound implications for democratic governance. If any successful challenge to existing policies was suspected of being artificially manufactured, then the legitimacy of democratic opposition itself came into question. The result was a political culture increasingly polarized between those who saw themselves as defending authentic public opinion against manipulation, and those who saw themselves as exposing the hidden forces behind apparent grassroots movements. The development of television as a mass medium accelerated these dynamics by making it possible to observe political events in real time, while simultaneously making it more difficult to distinguish between authentic and manufactured political activity. Television coverage of political rallies, for example, could make organized events appear spontaneous while making spontaneous events appear organized. The medium's emphasis on visual drama and narrative coherence encouraged interpretations that emphasized hidden connections and secret coordination over the messier realities of democratic politics. By the 1970s, the Watergate scandal had provided definitive proof that high-level government conspiracies were not only possible, but actual. The revelation that the President of the United States had participated in illegal surveillance and cover-up operations vindicated those who had argued that official explanations of government behavior were often false or incomplete. But the Watergate revelations also demonstrated the limits of conspiracy as a governing principle. The Nixon administration's attempts to operate in secret had ultimately made it less effective rather than more powerful. The cover-up had caused more damage than the original crime. The obsession with controlling information and eliminating enemies had distorted decision-making and alienated potential allies. Most importantly, the conspiracy had been exposed through the normal operation of democratic institutions, investigative journalism, congressional oversight, judicial proceedings. The system had worked, albeit slowly and imperfectly, to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. This suggested that while conspiracies were certainly possible, they were not omnipotent or undetectable. Yet the lesson many Americans drew from Watergate was not that democratic institutions were ultimately effective, but that official denials could not be trusted. If the government had lied about Watergate, what else might it be lying about? If one conspiracy had been exposed, how many others might remain hidden? This erosion of trust in official explanations created a fertile environment for alternative theories about everything from economic policy to foreign relations to social change. The assumption that governments routinely conspired against their own citizens became so widespread that it was almost impossible to have rational discussions about public policy without addressing underlying suspicions about hidden agendas and ulterior motives. The end of the Cold War in the early 1990s temporarily disrupted established conspiracy frameworks by eliminating the convenient explanation that communist infiltration was responsible for unwelcome social changes. But new frameworks quickly emerged to take its place. International organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank became suspect as vehicles for world government. Multinational corporations were accused of manipulating national governments for their own benefit. Cultural changes were attributed to deliberate campaigns by secular humanists, radical feminists, or other ideological conspiracies. The development of the internet in the 1990s and 2000s provided unprecedented opportunities for both conspiracy theorists and their critics. On one hand, digital technologies made it easier than ever to research historical claims, cross-reference sources, and expose false information. On the other hand, they also made it possible for anyone to publish their theories to a global audience without the filtering mechanisms that had traditionally separated credible information from speculation. The result was an explosion of conspiracy theories covering every conceivable topic, from the September 11 attacks to climate change to vaccination programs. Each theory attracted its own community of believers who developed increasingly elaborate explanations for why their claims were not accepted by mainstream institutions. The rejection of conspiracy theories by academic experts, government officials, and mainstream media was itself interpreted as evidence of how thoroughly these institutions had been infiltrated or corrupted. This dynamic created what scholars would later recognize as epistemic closure, information environments where alternative explanations were systematically excluded, and all evidence was interpreted through the lens of predetermined beliefs. Within these closed information systems, conspiracy theories became self-reinforcing and immune to outside challenge. The proliferation of these alternative information systems fragmented public discourse in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Where previous conspiracy theories had operated at the margins of mainstream culture, digital age theories could create their own parallel cultures with their own authorities, their own evidence standards, and their own internal logic. By the early 21st century, the Illuminati conspiracy theory had evolved far beyond its 18th century origins to become part of a vast ecosystem of interconnected theories about hidden power and secret manipulation. The specific claims about Adam Weishaupt's organization had been absorbed into larger narratives about ancient conspiracies stretching back to biblical times and forward to an apocalyptic future. These modern theories bore little resemblance to the historical reality of the Bavarian Illuminati, but they served similar psychological functions. They provided simple explanations for complex phenomena, offered the comfort of believing that someone was in control, even if that someone was malevolent, and created communities of believers united by their shared knowledge of hidden truths. The dark truth about the Illuminati's origins had become completely obscured by centuries of mythological elaboration. What had begun as a specific historical event, the formation of a small Enlightenment society in 18th century Bavaria, had become a universal template for understanding all of human history as the product of secret manipulation. Yet perhaps this transformation revealed something important about human nature itself. Perhaps the persistent appeal of conspiracy theories reflected deep-seated psychological needs that rational analysis alone could not satisfy. Perhaps the longing to believe in hidden patterns and secret purposes was itself a fundamental aspect of how human beings made sense of their world. As we drift towards sleep in our interconnected but fragmented digital age, surrounded by information systems that can make any theory seem plausible and any authority seem suspect, we might reflect on this troubling possibility. That the greatest conspiracy was not any specific plot by any particular group, but the human tendency to see plots everywhere, to find patterns in randomness, to prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The Illuminati's real legacy might not be any influence they actually exercised, but their demonstration that in a world complex enough to make conspiracy possible, the fear of conspiracy would become more powerful than conspiracy itself. They had accidentally discovered that the most effective way to control how people think is not to manipulate them directly, but to make them believe that someone else is manipulating them. In that sense, Adam Weishaupt's greatest achievement was not the organization he created, but the paranoia he unleashed. A paranoia that would prove more durable than any institution, more influential than any ideology, and more transformative than any actual conspiracy could ever be. The shadows the Illuminati cast in the 18th century had grown to cover the entire landscape of human understanding, creating a world where everything was suspect and nothing was certain, where the line between reality and fantasy had become permanently blurred, and where the search for truth had become indistinguishable from the manufacture of doubt. Tonight, as conspiracy theories continue to multiply in the digital darkness, we can only wonder whether humanity will ever find its way back to the light, or whether we are doomed to wander forever in the labyrinth of suspicion that a small group of Bavarian professors accidentally created when they dared to dream of perfecting the world through reason. As the digital age reached its full flowering in the early decades of the 21st century, the descendants of Weishaupt's conspiracy theory found themselves in an environment their 18th century ancestors could never have imagined. The same technologies that connected humanity in unprecedented ways also created new opportunities for both genuine coordination and paranoid interpretation on a scale that dwarfed anything the historical Illuminati could have conceived. Social media platforms became the new meeting halls where conspiracy theories could spread with viral efficiency. A single post could reach millions of people within hours, carrying claims that would have taken decades to circulate in Weishaupt's time. But unlike the careful, methodical recruitment processes the original Illuminati had employed, these digital networks operated through algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than understanding. The result was a